If I were a European and I listened to the dialogue over there and listened to what comes out of Washington, I'd be scared to death. First question I'd have is, why should we in the Netherlands, why should any reasonably intelligent Dutchman want to go to war in eastern Ukraine? Over what? For what? German losses in the last year of the Second World War, and it wasn't even a year, I would say it was like 9 months, were much larger than they had taken in all the months before the end of the war. This happens at the end of conflicts. Things fall apart, people are trying to withdraw, disengage from combat, and they're slaughtered. That's happening in Ukraine. It's inhumane. We should stop it. We in Washington should intervene and say, no, stop. Let's come to some sort of negotiated settlement before Ukraine is completely destroyed. But no one will do it.
Hello, everybody. My name is Paul Buitink, and welcome to a new episode of the Reinvent Money podcast, in which we discuss geopolitics, money, and power. First of all, I would like to welcome the thousands of new subscribers that the channel has gained over the past few weeks due to the popular videos with Catherine Olsen-Fitz, David Webb, and Jeffrey Sachs. I'm humbled by this growth, so thank you so much. And I'm also very pleased with my guest today. He was a former senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense in 2020. He's a regular guest on the Tucker Carlson show and is known for his unconventional views when it comes to the different conflicts that the world suffers from at the moment. Please welcome Colonel Douglas Macgregor.
Very good morning, or good afternoon.
Yeah, good morning on your end. Well, thanks so much to accept my invitation and be on my show. Let's start with NATO. Last week, NATO turned 75 years old. Should it last another 75 years, or should it be dismantled?
Well, I don't think we have to dismantle it. That will happen in the course of time, one way or the other. NATO's original raison d'etre was the Soviet threat, which vanished. And in time, I think Europeans will discover, probably sooner rather than later, that there is no real threat from Russia. If there are problems, they're probably internal. As I say in the United States, if you're looking for existential threats to the United States, they're here inside our country and on our borders. They're not in some distant land overseas.
Yeah, so when Trump, for example, says that he is not sure whether he's going to support certain members of NATO when they don't fulfill the promise to invest 2% of their GDP in defense, you would agree with him?
Oh, I think so. I think more importantly, he took the position, and I agree with him strongly, that the people in Europe need to be their own first responders. The European states have turned themselves into what I would call military and to a lesser extent economic dependencies of the greater American empire. Now that suits people in Washington, where everything is mortgaged to ego. And people sitting in Washington like to think that they are at the center of the universe and control the entire world. They're getting an education right now that that's not the case, but it's an attitude that's going to die very hard. I think Europeans really need to take control of their own destiny. If they haven't figured it out yet, Charles de Gaulle was right. Charles de Gaulle was widely hated when he said it, but he was absolutely on target. He said, Europeans need to understand something. Britain is an island, and Americans do not live in Europe. He was absolutely correct. We don't. Eisenhower, who at the time of NATO's founding was still on active duty as a general and then subsequently became president in the 50s, made the argument in the 50s that if in 10 years NATO still exists and we failed in our jobs, his view was that Europe had to stand on its own feet, and more important, that we had to, through diplomacy primarily, come to some sort of arrangement with Russia in Europe. At that time, the Soviet Union. I think if he were alive today, he'd take the same position. By the way, he also advocated strongly for neutrality for the various states in Eastern Europe as well as in the Balkans. His argument was simple. We Americans do not have the resources to defend all of these places in the event that the Soviet Union decides to attack them. It's still true today. We simply don't have those resources. In fact, that's the final problem for us. And that is people in Washington continue to delude themselves and believe that it's really 1991. That we are the same state, the same nation, the same society with the same military power that we had in 91. We're not. we've changed profoundly, and we've dismantled much of our military power.
So would you then also think that the US would need to drop this whole Wolfowitz doctrine of trying to pursue a primacy and an hegemony across the world, full spectrum dominance?
I mean, the damage done by Wolfowitz in his little paper penned back in the 1990s is incalculable. Because it was a justification for us to meddle in the affairs of others all over the world. And of course, you'll remember Madeleine Albright, who came into office under Bill Clinton, enunciated the notion of the indispensable superpower. Her view was that nothing can or should happen on the planet unless we were somehow or another involved. This, of course, is the antithesis of everything that the people that founded the United States and built it up into the country that it eventually became believed.
Yeah. So you said the Europeans need to defend themselves. At the same time, you don't see a clear and present threat for Europe coming from Russia. So in that sense, Europe would have time to start building up their own defense.
Well, the first question I have is, what is Europe?
Yeah, that's, of course, there's European Union, there's Europe. How would you define Europe?
Well, I'm not going to define it for you, but I'm going to ask you to look objectively at your own history and your own position. There was a long memorandum penned by Prince Gorshakov, who was the foreign minister of Russia back in the 1870s. And at the end, he was arguing for all sorts of interesting things. But at the end of the memorandum, he wrote something about the concert of Europe and what the concert of Europe expects. Bismarck took this memorandum, and before he sent it in to the King of Prussia, who was then the new Emperor of Germany, he scribbled in the margins, what is the concert of Europe? Well, my question is, what is Europe? Because I've lived in Europe off and on for almost 10 years of my life. Eight of those years spent largely in Germany, and 2 years in Belgium. Now, I don't see much evidence for that kind of Europe. But what I see is a northern Europe and a Central East Europe and a Western Europe and a Southern Europe and a Southeastern Europe and the Balkans. And then there is a distant Eastern Europe. You know, I still regard the Russians as Europeans, so they may not have participated in what we in the West call the three great events of Western civilization, the Reformation, the Renaissance, and the Enlightenment. Nevertheless, they are Europeans. They speak an Indo-European language, and their culture is not that alien to us, contrary to popular belief. So what is Europe? And I think what happens is that everyone in Berlin who looks east has a view of the world that is not very different from the people in Berlin in 1900 who looked east. And the people in Paris who look south, east, west, north, their view of the world isn't very different from what it used to be. Now, that doesn't mean that no one has changed and people are unreconstructed Neanderthals. No, I'm simply being honest about what's important in each of these countries, what leads them to cooperate or fight. I think the Europeans have to look at themselves objectively and decide where is the commonality of interest and culture that supports a true security zone. Because frankly, if you think the Italians, the Spaniards, the Portuguese, the Greeks, or even the French for that matter, are remotely interested in fighting a war in Ukraine, you've lost your mind. No one there is interested. It's not going to happen. And frankly speaking, to most of them, whatever happens in that part of the world is irrelevant to them. This is not a new problem. You know, during the Versailles Treaty discussions, when they were trying to put together new solutions, if you will, all of which turned out to be disastrous for, post-war Europe, no one involved in these discussions knew anything about the world really much beyond Berlin and Vienna. Everything that happened in Budapest, Prague, Warsaw, and these other places was a mystery. And they made bad decisions that came back to haunt us horribly. So I don't think that you can compel unanimity of interest on the basis of an artificial construct called the European Union. The same is true for NATO. I mean, remember, people used to talk all the time about NATO's real mission is to keep the Soviets out and the Germans down and all this nonsense. Well, that all went away. It's all irrelevant now. We didn't try to put anything in its place, but we also didn't try to induce anyone in Europe to think about an alternative. One of the first things that I believed very strongly when I came back from Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe in 2000 was that the military commander, the Supreme Commander of Allied Powers Europe, should not be an American, should be a European. Now, if the Europeans want to rotate that, that's fine. Do whatever they want. But it was time for us to get out of the business of dominating Europe militarily. The problem was that when you sat down with the Europeans and said, well, if you're going to operate effectively, you need to build your own command, control, communications, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance complex. In other words, you have to have the space-based capabilities and all this sort of thing. Everybody's eyes glowed over. So, well, the Americans bring that. And I said, well, as long as the Americans are bringing that, you're going to end up under their command and control. Now, we've done everything in our power, let's be frank, to drag Europe into a war against Russia. This did not begin in February of 2022. We've been doing this for years. We started decisively in 2014 when we destabilized Ukraine, replaced the government. We launched a coup, all backed by the CIA, and installed essentially a regime in Kiev that was prepared to be hostile to Russia and carry out our interests. So, is this the future Europeans want? And now you have this ruling elite, if you will, governing all of your countries, telling you that this is wonderful, that everyone should go to war with Russia, and depicting Russia as though it were still a Soviet state under Stalin, which is absurd. None of that's true. Now, some people say, well, the Russian human rights record isn't this or that. I've got news for you. You can point to many, many flaws in everybody's society in every country. The United States is hardly, invulnerable to that sort of criticism. We've all got problems internally with all sorts of things. That doesn't justify a war with anybody, especially since the Russians haven't taken any action that is fundamentally anti-European. On the contrary, you've had the Russians bending over backwards ever since this finally, the Cold War, which was really a hot war going on in Ukraine for years. When that finally blew up in everyone's faces, the Russian government has still bent over backwards to avoid conflict with Europe. Doesn't want it, wants to do business. I just, it's astonishing to me that this never finds its way into the mainstream media. And if I were a European and I listened to the dialogue over there and listened to what comes out of Washington, I'd be scared to death. First question I'd have is, why should we in the Netherlands, why should any reasonably intelligent Dutchman want to go to war in eastern Ukraine? Over what? For what?
Yeah, the main reason they are now trying to sell is that if we don't do anything about what's going on in Ukraine, then the Baltics would be next. With the first casualty would be Lithuania, because then Putin would try to establish a land bridge between Russia and Kaliningrad. How would you assess that threat? Is there any truth to that claim, or?
No, not at all. But the longer we sustain this hostility and pursue conflict Russia, the more the Russians will feel compelled to defend themselves and take actions that they think are prudent. So that means any number of different things. We can't undo right now the disaster of Kaliningrad, turning Königsberg, which for 1,000 years was a German-speaking city in a largely German-dominated area, over to Stalin, which was done basically on the basis of a short note between Stalin and FDR as FDR was dying. And Stalin said, oh, well, you wouldn't mind, would you, if we just kept Königsberg? We'd like to have the port. Is that a problem? And FDR said, oh, of course not. By all means, have at it. These are how decisions are made, sadly, when the wrong people are in power who know nothing. So we're still struggling with that. But having said all of that, no, I don't see any evidence that the Russians want this. I mean, first of all, war, contrary to popular belief, is not a good business opportunity. It's deranged. And I think Europeans in general have figured that out. At least I thought they had. So the idea of a war on the European continent, which was for years anathema to everyone, has now suddenly become acceptable. Again, I think the Europeans need to look at this thing more objectively and start asking what is in their interest. Do they have any interest? I mean, the same people telling you in the Netherlands that you should be prepared to fight the evil Russians who aren't coming are also trying to destroy your farmland, your agrarian sector. I mean, the Netherlands is probably, if not the most productive agricultural system in the world, then it's pretty damn close. Yet you seem to be bent on destroying it. I mean, this is like the Germans who have said, no, 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 we don't want real energy. So we're going to destroy our scientific industrial base, which is the foundation for much of Europe's prosperity and their own, in favor of turning ourselves into an agrarian wasteland. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. The world is turned upside down. People need to start looking at this nonsense and asking hard questions.
So if Europe would stop tomorrow with supplying weapons, I mean, first of all, I don't think we have that many weapons left anymore. Maybe the first question, what's the situation like when it comes to our inventory of weapon and ammo in Europe? Are we close to depleted or?
Yeah, of course. I mean, you don't need to ask me that question. Just ask the European military leaders, and they'll all tell you that their arsenals are at a low point, and the Europeans are not postured and organized to produce great quantities of ammunition or weapons on their own very quickly. Now, that's a consequence, I think, of civilization maturing over many decades. But it's not a function of something that we've done to you. You've done it to yourselves. We've done something similar to ourselves. Our own stocks are very, very low. And in the midst of all of this kind of craziness, we're talking about going to war with Russia. And Russia surprised everyone at its ability to rapidly stand up enormous manufacturing power inside the country to create new weapon systems and limitless sources of rockets and missiles and ammunition. Now, I'm sure you and others have all listened carefully to the news media telling us, oh, well, the Russians are running out of rockets. They're running out of missiles. They're running out of, this can't go on much more. Good Lord, this is insane. Just as the phony losses that were perpetrated. Well, the Russians are running out of manpower. They've taken such heavy losses. It's never true. It's all nonsense. You got to wake up over in Europe, just as the American people have slowly begun to wake up here and understand you're being lied to. And
what's the death toll, you think, now in Russia and Ukraine in terms of soldiers and civilians that are lost at the moment?
Well, given the fact that, remember that the Russians, after an initial phase of moving into the territories they currently occupy, ended largely in the summer and early fall of 2022, they went on to the strategic defensive. If you're on the strategic defensive, you can inflict far, far more casualties than you take. So I would say that probably there's somewhere between 60 and 80,000 killed in action in Russia. Probably twice that many wounded. But given the length of time that this war has taken, that's actually modest. If you look at the Ukrainian side, it's well over 500,000 dead. And I've been attacked for months for telling people that. It's well over 500,000 dead now. They're losing more soldiers every day today than they ever lost in the past. We shouldn't be surprised. They're falling apart. They're collapsing. So they're falling back. German losses in the last year of the Second World War, it wasn't even a year, I would say it was like 9 months, were much larger than they had taken in all the months before the end of the war. This happens at the end of conflicts. Things fall apart, people are trying to withdraw, disengage from combat, and they're slaughtered. That's happening in Ukraine. It's inhumane. We should stop it. We in Washington should intervene and say, no, stop. Let's come to some sort of negotiated settlement before Ukraine is completely destroyed. But no one will do it.
Yeah, I talked to a few generals, former generals in Holland for my Dutch podcast. In fact, this morning I talked to a former commander, and he agrees that Ukraine is running out of ammo and running out of troops. At the same time, he still firmly believes that in order for Ukraine to negotiate properly, they need to be fortified. They need to have more weapons in order to have a better position at the negotiation table. But you disagree with that?
Their position is not going to improve at this point. Whom are they going to train and arm? An enormous amount of effort has been invested over the last 2.5 to 3 years to train up and arm troops from Ukraine. There's only so much you can do. I think it's because Europeans, particularly Western Europeans, are so remote from reality when it comes to warfare. They've forgotten that you build a military establishment over decades. You don't snap your fingers and bring something into existence. That's number one. Number two, there's far too much fascination with what I would call silver bullet technology. If we just give the Ukrainians enough Javelin missiles, they'll destroy all those Russian tanks. No. If we just give them enough Taurus missiles, we can obliterate their logistical infrastructure. No. In other words, if we give them something that appears to be another miracle weapon, what Hitler called Wunderwaffe, that sort of nonsense is going to change things. No, it will not. There was never any chance to begin with for Ukraine to be successful. They had as much chance against Russia as Mexico would have against the United States. Forget it. I'm surprised that in many respects they've done as well as they have, but I think that's also a function of two things. First of all, the Russian military establishment and its leadership do not want to take heavy casualties. For the first time, certainly since, I would say, the mid or late 19th century, there is a true interest in preserving Russian life in uniform. I mean, during World War II, we now know that the losses in that country, at least 15 to 16 million soldiers were killed, and another 20 plus million civilians, probably a total of 39 to 40 million dead in total. This is not that. The Russians are not going to do that, and they don't need to, and they know that. And Putin is also a man of immense patience. There are others that wanted to move more decisively, and he said, if you move more decisively, it will create the illusion that we are everything they say we are, that we're bad, that we're trying to conquer. He said, that's not what we're about. We don't want to do that. We don't want to kill more Orthodox Slavs. That's not our position. That's not why we're here. Putin has won this war through patience and persistence and perseverance. And I think now in the spring, and I think that's late April into mid-May, once the ground is dry, the Russians will sweep forward and end this war.
Right. But also at the start of the war, you said a few times that the war would end soon, right? So it's taking longer than you initially expected.
Well, obviously, I was not privileged to the underlying assumptions of Russian military planning. But I now know that the Russian military, in fact, did want to launch decisive operations very early with the goal of rapidly penetrating eastern Ukraine in depth. It was President Putin who changed the assumptions. He said, first of all, we don't want to kill lots of people. And of course, the Russian generals always say, well, how do you go to war without killing large numbers of people? They wanted to launch strikes against all the Ukrainian barracks and facilities where Ukrainian soldiers were housed, inflicting as many losses then as possible before even going into the country. Secondly, he wanted to move very slowly because he said, we want to make sure the people know we're coming to liberate them, because he knew that large numbers of people in eastern Ukraine were Russians. And they expected, some help from Russia because they'd been oppressed and mistreated. Well, that worked initially, but then the Russians in eastern Ukraine asked the question, well, what are you going to do now? Are you going to stay? And their answer was, no, we're just here to effectively send signals to the regime in Kiev that we want you to be treated fairly. We're not going to stay. Once we've defeated these Ukrainians, made our point, we'll withdraw. Well, then Russians in eastern Ukraine said, that's wonderful. So after we work with you and you're here, and you leave, the Ukrainian secret police will show up and shoot all of us in the head. And they said, frankly, the hell with you. If you're not going to do it, get out. Don't come in here. You're just going to make matters worse. Well, I think it took President Putin until the summer for these reports to sink in with him. And his general said, we've wasted a lot of time. The Ukrainians have had time to build up. Now we're faced with a very large force. It's going to take us time to destroy them. We're going to have to go into a war mode. In other words, we're going to have to produce munitions and produce equipment. And when they first went into eastern Ukraine, they were told, well, we've got about 6,000 old tanks sitting here. So let's just use up the old tanks. So if you have a T-72 and it stops running, it's got a problem, forget about it. Jump off the tank, we'll get you another tank. I mean, literally, these are the things they said. There was an expectation that this would not be long. There was an expectation that this would be short, because I also think President Putin genuinely believed that he would have a negotiating partner in Washington and in Europe. So by the summer, it's very clear, especially after the opportunity for an agreement was destroyed by us and our friends in London, in Istanbul, it became very clear, look, we're not going to have an end to this. This is now going to be a long war. And when that was realized, then everything changes. And suddenly, all right, we're going to have to bring in more troops. We're going to have to mobilize more forces. And we're going to have to set up some sort of temporary defense. And of course, at the time, new general officers showed up, new decisions were made, and they established this very effective strategic defense. And you'll recall that they made the decision to pull back out of Kherson and to essentially abandon a corridor just south of Kharkov, because they said, right now, we don't have time to hold it. The Russians always understood throughout their history, and this is something we do not understand in the West. Territory is only valuable, that is, ground is only valuable insofar as it gives you an operational or tactical military advantage. Otherwise, you drive over it or you fly over it. It has no value. So that's why they have succeeded over centuries, falling back over vast distances, compelling their adversary to follow them, to come to grips with them. It's worked. And in this case, they saw that the leadership in Kiev and the leadership in Washington was, frankly, stubborn, stupid, backward, and would expend itself in pointless attacks on an effective strategic defense. And it's worked. Right. If you go, one last comment, Europeans need to understand this. If you go back to World War I, look at the so-called Eastern Front between Imperial Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Tsarist Russia. There's very little movement. And what do the Germans do? The Germans in the north advance to the Baltic littoral, essentially take the Baltic littoral and quote unquote liberate it from the Russians, although they were not hopelessly oppressed by the Tsar by any means, and then overrun Poland just east of Warsaw. And this line then stretches down to the Carpathians and takes in much of the end of Western Ukraine and Galicia. Now, that's where they stayed. That's it. Yeah. Because they knew there was nothing out there but endless territory, miles of nothing.
And with this in mind,
you don't win wars by squandering your resources as Hitler did in 1941, 42, 43, and then ultimately 44. That's not how you win wars. Russians understood that. They learned it the hard way in World War I when they expended themselves against the Germans.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's also in the West you often read that Russia is doing a bad job gaining any territory, but it seems the Russians are primarily in the process of basically demilitarizing not only Ukraine but the whole of NATO. Basically, they set up a trap in which we lose a lot of weapons. But in keeping in mind what you just said, what then would be the strategy of Russia if we should decide to stop supplying Ukraine with arms? How far do you think they will move to the West?
Well, I know how far they don't want to move. They really don't want to cross the Dnieper River and march all the way to the border with Poland and Moldova and Romania. That is something they don't want to do. If they're compelled, they'll do it. In other words, if no one will talk to them, no one will negotiate, no one will do business, then obviously that's an option, and it should not be dismissed. It's real. They would prefer to close up, I think, the territory, certainly north of Zaporozhye, to the Dnieper River. They want Kharkov, it's historically a Russian city, to be Russian again. Odessa, which was never Ukrainian, always Russian. They will want Odessa to be Russian again. And I do not think that they will back off of those territorial demands. Certainly not now. Now, if we're smart, we'll get on with business and cut the best deal that we can that allows Ukraine in some smaller form to exist. I just don't know if that'll happen or not. And if we don't talk, then again, the Russians will decide whether or not it's time to cross the river, march into Kiev, and then march west to Lvov. I don't think that's what they want to do. Remember, Kiev is practically analogous to Jerusalem. when it comes to Western Christians and Jews. So I don't think they want to fight anybody in the streets of Kiev if they can avoid it. But they may conclude they can't.
Also, there's so much hatred towards the Russians in the west of Ukraine and Kiev as well that it will become like an Afghanistan for Russia if they want to occupy that city.
I don't think so. The Western Ukrainians, and by the way, I grew up with them in the United States, and I know them very well, are incurably anti-communist. And unfortunately, the communist identity is confused with Russia. But even the ones that I grew up with had a view that the Russians were the victims as much of Stalin as they were. They had a different view of things, but I don't see that happening. Look, Putin is no fool. He's made speeches publicly in the past where he said, we understand Ukraine. We've lived with the Ukrainians for many years. We know the people in Western Ukraine want nothing to do with us. We want nothing to do with them. They'd probably be happier if they were confederated in some loose fashion with the Poles. Remember that Western Ukraine was under Polish-Lithuanian domination for centuries. And before it was under Polish-Lithuanian domination, after the Mongol conquest, it fell under the Duke of Lithuania. So the people in the West are different. Their language is different. Their culture is different. He knows that. Doesn't want anything to do with it. The last thing he wants to do is govern them. What I'm trying to tell people is, if you're stupid and you refuse to sit down with Moscow and hammer out a solution, however imperfect you may think it is, and however humiliating it will undoubtedly be for us because of our stupid position vis-a-vis Moscow, we need to do it. We need to do it for humanity. We need to do it for the sake of Ukraine. We need to do it for Europe. We need to close the chapter on this terrible war and make sure nothing like this happens again on the European continent. We're not doing that. We're doing the opposite. We're trying to keep it going.
And if Trump wins the election, what would be his action towards the conflict? Would he directly call Putin and try to broker a deal, or what do you expect?
Knowing President Trump a little bit as I do, I know that his instincts are good. And yes, to your question, he'll want to come to a resolution. The question is, what about the rest of the government? The mistake that was made in 2017 was the assumption that you elect a new president and suddenly everything changes. Well, the federal bureaucracy didn't change. Congress did not change. And so the attitudes remained the same. And he never got control of the Department of Defense, the Department of State, or the intelligence agencies.
Deep state, basically, then.
Yeah, these remained in the hands of his enemies, people who were determined to obstruct him at every turn. They're still here in Washington. They still dominate the place. Now, the question is, who's on his team? And when I look at the people on his team, I'm frightened because most of them are not really aligned with him. They've signed on with him in the hopes that he'll be elected and they can do what they did the last time. Ride on his coattails, profit enormously, but fundamentally change nothing. Everyone inside the Washington community, if you want to call it that, is invested in the status quo. They've all got to go away, to be blunt, for anything to change.
So drain the swamp like Trump initially set out to do. And if you would be asked to become part of his administration, would you say yes to that?
It would depend on what the president asked me to do, but keep in mind, whenever the president of the United States asks you if you would do something, it's an honor to serve. I truly believe that. So I would take it very, very seriously. The problem is one man inside a team of people who are still opposed to the president in reality isn't going to make much difference. Everyone will stop. You know, one of the things he did, he found out he was issuing directives. I want every American soldier out of Syria. And so he was told, okay, we'll do that. Then a few months later, he discovered they haven't left Syria. Well, they never left Syria. People lied to him and told him that this was happening. President Eisenhower warned Kennedy when Kennedy became president in 1961. He said, you've got to be ruthless because you will tell people to do things and expect them to be done. And in some cases, they won't do it. If they don't, you've got to be ruthless and rid yourself of these people, crush them. Expel them from the government. Said the same thing is true for people who who may be disloyal, who decide to talk to the media, who decide to undermine your policies. Be ruthless, expel them. He went down the list. Well, of course, Kennedy didn't do that. And he went through the Bay of Pigs disaster. And then after the Bay of Pigs disaster, he suddenly realized, my God, the CIA is against me. Department of Defense is against me. The Department of State hasn't helped me. Well, this is the problem. You've got to go in there and clean it out. You've got to decapitate all of those agencies and then begin to shrink the bureaucracies. And that, of course, it's going to be painful. I think the opportunity will present itself in this country, but probably not until we collapse financially. And of course, I think that's coming. It's just that nobody knows precisely when. But, we're at a $35 trillion sovereign national debt and growing by $1 trillion every 100 days. If Europeans think that that's sustainable over time, they're going to have to sit down and explain that to me, because I don't think it is.
Well, I mean, I think Europe looks even worse than the US in terms of their financial sustainability. But I agree, it's the whole financial system is not sustainable as it is right now. What's your view on China, though? Is that do you expect a front line to open up there anytime soon? Do you expect China to invade Taiwan this year?
No, China's not going to invade Taiwan unless we put troops and missiles on the Taiwanese island. Now, we've been very stupid lately. We put special forces on the small islands close to the Chinese coast that belong to Taiwan. The Chinese don't like it. The Chinese will watch it, but they're probably not going to lose much sleep over a few special forces. At the same time, we recently conducted a silly amphibious exercise with 2,000 Marines off the coast of Taiwan. That's sort of like reenacting a bayonet charge from 1865. That's sort of stupid. The Chinese aren't going to worry about that. But if we put serious missiles in the region, and particularly on Taiwan, then all bets are off. At that point, the Chinese will have to make a decision. Do we cross 100 miles of water and risk losing lots of people on the trip? Or do we just simply flatten Taiwan? I think they'd flatten it.
That will be one big economic disaster, apart from being a humanitarian disaster. But given the fact that so many chips are produced there, the whole world economy would grind to a halt, I would say.
Well, the Chinese don't want to do it. The Chinese buy chips. The Koreans do. The Japanese do. They're all invested in what's going on in Taiwan. To be frank with you, there's no one in Asia that I can find is interested in going to war with anybody. The only people who are talking about war are Americans. And that's a fact. Go to Northeast Asia, visit, talk to the people over there. And, are they afraid of China? Well, they're afraid of China, but not for the reasons we think. They're not afraid of Chinese militarily. But China is a nation of, 1.2, 1.3 billion people. They can barely hold themselves together. And no one wants more Chinese in their countries, because when you allow Chinese to enter your country in any great numbers, they go from 20,000 to 2 million, from 2 million to 20 million, from 20 million to 30 million, and suddenly you've lost your country. That's the history of Asia. Much of what today we call China was stabilized over the last 1,000 years, but most of it was not originally Chinese. The areas that stretch from Shanghai all the way to the border with Vietnam were originally Vietnamese. Well, what happened to them? They were absorbed, gone. I mean, we could spend hours talking about this. That's something the Asians worry about. And I think they worry about it economically. The Chinese are very good at practicing economic imperialism. Although, to his credit, Xi has opened his markets, for instance, to the Japanese, to their agricultural products, to everything. Because historically, the reason for Japanese hostility to China was that the Chinese position was, you pay tribute to us and to the emperor, we will admit you to our markets. Well, the Japanese aren't going to pay tribute to anybody. And so you had some wars. But we shouldn't lose sight of the problems in China. I mean, they had an inspection of missiles in the coastal defenses, the air defense belts. Then they discovered that much of the fuel had been drained away from some of these rockets and missiles. these things weren't operational. Well, that's the other problem is corruption. It's a sea of corruption. China is too big to govern.
Yeah. So that's an also a Achilles heel ultimately, right? It's also sort of overreach at some point. You become too big and then you'll disintegrate.
Well, that's what's happened historically, and usually it's a failure of the dynasty to feed and protect everyone.
Yeah.
Protect people from invasion, because China over the last 1,000 years or so, I think I saw a statistic indicating for almost 400 of those last 1,000 years, China has been under foreign government. Usually it was Mongolian, Turkic. Sometimes it was European. They're very sensitive to the South China Sea because all of the fuel, all the oil, the natural gas, and the food that comes out of East Africa and from the Persian Gulf all passes through the Strait of Malacca and up through the South China Sea. Well, they learned to fear this because the Royal Navy taught them to fear it. Britain's Royal Navy commanded everything, and the Chinese were in serious trouble. So from that standpoint, the Chinese are worried that we will try to do to them what the Royal Navy did. And of course, we do an excellent imitation of the Royal Navy whenever we can to try and bully or humiliate them at sea. We talk about, the Chinese are being aggressive. No, not really. And most of what happens in these areas is of no consequence to us. What we have said historically is that we think everyone should be able to trade freely across the oceans. The Chinese have never stopped a commercial vessel. So if they've never stopped a commercial vessel, why are we interested? And if Chinese and Vietnamese and Filipinos and Thais and others want to have fights at sea over fishing grounds, well, let them have it. I don't want to get involved. I mean, that would be like sailing the United States Navy north of Scotland to fight it out between the people in Iceland, Ireland, and Scotland over fishing grounds. It's crazy.
Right. Yeah, that's a very clear and accurate analysis. Maybe some final words of advice. We already talked about Europe, of course, but I'm European. I live in the Netherlands. I worry about our prospects, and I see leadership that's failing. Maybe could you summarize your word of advice to Europeans? The elections are coming up, of course, in June. So some positive advice for us Europeans. What can we do to improve our circumstances?
Well, if the Europeans want what I would call prosperity and security, then they should vote everyone that's currently running their government out of office and recognize that it will take at least a decade for Europe, just as it will in the United States, to recover from the damage that's been done for years, but specifically the very serious damage over the last 3 years, 3.5 years. I go back always to the 1990s and see the damage commencing in 1992 and then sort of growing steadily worse. You've got a huge problem with millions of people inside Europe who are not Europeans, who don't want to be Europeans, who can't become Europeans. Do you want to survive or not? I was reading the other day about a discussion between the Swedish representatives and Marshal Bernadotte, the Marshal of Napoleon that was ultimately elected by the Swedish parliament to come and rule Sweden. And the question was asked, and I think it was Bernadotte who asked, why is it that you would want a French marshal to rule Sweden? And they gave several reasons, but they said, we are an ancient state. We want to survive. Your leadership is critical to our survival. Well, I think Europeans should look at it in the same fashion. When I was at Supreme Headquarters of Allied Powers Europe, we took the position, I'm saying we as an American, I certainly took the position that if water is purest at its source, then Europe is the fountainhead of our civilization. If you self-destruct through pointless wars, self-inflicted immigration or migration that you don't want, that is ruining your society, then that fountainhead of civilization dies. I don't want it to die. And I see the United States as inextricably intertwined with Europe, its culture, its history, its civilization. And that's why I and others served in the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance, because we believed that. Well, things have changed, and there is no longer a requirement for us to be in Europe in large numbers to help defend Europe against the evil Russians. They're not coming. Wake up, smell the coffee, it's over. The Russians don't want to come. You've got other problems, though, inside your own society, just as we do. You must address those. So end this pointless conflict. If you want prosperity and security, let's strive for peace and a negotiated settlement as soon as possible so that you can get back to what's really important. Instead of destroying the agricultural sector in the Netherlands or Germany, how about protecting it? Because let's face it, enough is produced that you can feed more than just Europe, which is a good thing. Why would we want to destroy that?
Well, Mr. Macgregor, thanks so much for your time. It was a truly remarkable conversation. I wish you well, and perhaps we can do it again in the future.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Paul. Good luck.
Thanks.